legal horse gambling out of the Jockey Club and also all of its storefront outlets all through Hong Kong earns for the club over 7,000 US dollars per capita in Hong Kong, which is then applied to charities and educational purposes. So that's what keeps the horses running. This is a businessman, I think Alan Lee, and his French wife, who have a special viewing platform there just to see if their horse is going backwards or forwards. The Chinese community of Hong Kong is very internationalized, very well-educated, cosmopolitan, but also still very Chinese. So when they have a wedding, which is a very big event, of course, they will have usually a big restaurant reception, and then all of the guests are supposed to give a little cash gift to the newlyweds. So it's a profit-based business in China in general, but especially in Hong Kong, where they'll throw these lavish banquets. Now they're going around toasting their guests here, and typically on the center of the table there'll be a bottle of cognac. Hong Kong has the highest cognac drinking rate of any place in the world, so you'll see a lot of ads for the competing brandies and cognacs. But the couple will always have a snifter with tea, so they can make it to all the tables. So there's a little contrast in cultures. There was, of course, Hong Kong has a lot of popular culture and has been famous for all its kung fu films and things. Now it has a lot of mainland culture coming down. So here's a dancer in a Buddhist aspera saintly dance in one of the big floor shows. And there's a lot of festivals, and there's an opera house and a Chinese orchestra, Western orchestra, all kinds of things going on in Hong Kong as a major cultural center. Most famously, its indigenous Hong Kong film culture is very large. They probably produce more films per capita than any other city in the world, and rivaling Bombay and the Bollywood now. But here's an icon for one of the film festivals, and you've probably seen some of these. They're long on action and short on conversation sometimes. This is Bruce Lee, who lived out on one of the islands. Chow Yun-fat, the current Cantonese actor who's very well known, is also a Hong Kong native. All of this mixture is made possible, though, by education. I just list here that they have universal public schools, and they've had this longer than any other part of China, certainly. Much of it was started by missionaries. So when you go around Hong Kong, you'll see a lot of missionary schools that are still independently operating from the public system. But now, all the children in Hong Kong, in addition to English, they must learn Mandarin, so that they are being integrated with the rest of mainland China. Then there are many large universities, Hong Kong University, Chinese University, and numerous technical, polytechnical institutes and engineering training, now marketing, finance institutes. So Hong Kong is probably the leader in education for the rest of China. And this is one of its impacts on China, is that it is the training center for many, many people come from the mainland now. This is part of Hong Kong University and one of the new facilities. Now I'm going to just show you a little bit about how we will get around, let's say, because we'll be docking right here. Here's a view from a ship looking over to Central, and that's the Star Ferry, the terminal here. I'm sure many of you have hopped that classic ferry boat. They've kept it in operation. It's still a private company, but it is such an icon of the great city that they haven't modernized their fleet. These old boats are almost 80 to 100 years old, which means they know how to go somewhere. And they only cost maybe 5 Hong Kong dollars, I think it is, to get on, so less than even less than Vietnam, where everything is $1. In Hong Kong dollars, it's less than $1 US to go across the ferry. It's only about a 10-minute ride. But they have this traditional design, open air, no air conditioning. Some of the newer ones that go to the off-islands are much bigger, much more modern. But these old Star Ferries are really a treat to just jump across and back and forth. You can get on the new underground, the MTR, which goes quickly everywhere, but it's more fun to get on these ferry boats. Well, here's a map of the ferry terminals right here in Central, the major buildings here. When you get off the terminal, you can get a map that'll have a much more specific view of it. But Central stretches along the harbor, then there are hills, and it quickly turns into a residential district. So behind this great wall of office buildings. You start to get the crowds on the street. There are a lot of walkways that go in between the buildings, so you don't need to be down on the street level, especially if it's raining or hot. You can walk between all these interconnected buildings in Central, or you can jump on one of the trams that run along the shorefront to Wan Chai and out to North Point and all the way to Kennedy Town and all these little neighborhoods that are on Hong Kong Island. These trams have kept going in electrical trams, they are, which many other cities got rid of them and they replaced their street transportation with just cars and just buses. There's plenty of that in Hong Kong also, but these have right-of-way, and so they will often slice or get through the traffic when everybody else is stuck. And it's fun to sit up on top and watch the world go by. Here's a building that's a little bit further up from the Main Street, Queens Road, down in the main office area. This is, it used to be a milk production facility, and now it's the Foreign Correspondents Club. So if you happen to see this, it's up just a short walk up from Alexander Plaza. You can go in, and it's the place where many a journalist would sit and rue the fate of the world over their scotch and sodas. And many famous journalists actually spent their time, sent their telexes and made their phone calls from this building. And you can go in and have a drink as long as you say you are a journalist, which I'm sure you all are. Then if you go up even further, you start to get in the mid-levels. And this is the prime residential neighborhood. I'm sure many of you might have had one of these skyboxes, but we used to have dinner on a beautiful patio roof of Madame Lindblad. And she thought she had the best place in town, but sure enough, the next year, one thing went up, another, and suddenly she had what they call the frog's view of the universe, looking up with no more harbor view, but people will pay up to, I don't know, $10,000 US to rent a apartment, a small one that has a harbor view. But these buildings continue to rise, and the real estate market has picked up again, so they're building more and more. If you come all the way up to the top of there's a funicular that'll ride up from mid-levels. There's also public escalators that go up these hills. And then if you get to the top, this is at Victoria Peak, the great overlook, and that's a restaurant, believe it or not. And then you can see the whole town. Now this view is particularly beautiful at night. There's also a walkway. There's a park up there, and you can walk through the forest and the last remnant piece of the tropical jungle that Hong Kong used to be, and then get a view of the whole city as it is laid out below in the harbor. Now, on the other side of the harbor is Kowloon, and the central area is called Tsim Sha Tsui, and this is the main shopping area, though. There's plenty of shops on the central side, but this is an area where there's still quite a few small neighborhoods, night markets, street stands, and there's a Hong Kong museum. That's a very good museum if you have time to go see it. There's the new railway station that's up. It used to be right down here, but it's now over there. And Kai Tak Airport's just to the north of this. Here's the main road, Nathan Road, which has a jumble of commerce all the way going up into the residential neighborhoods of Upper Kowloon. Here again is the railroad station, tower, and if you just go for a walk on Nathan Road, and you can take almost any side road, you'll end up in these kind of, well, they're not very attractive buildings, but they are packed with life and signage. And this is where I first stayed when I came, and the Chungking House, which has 6 bunk dormitories for the likes of sailors, and it's mostly run by Indians. They have all these Indian shops down below, and it used to have opium parlors in it, but now they only sell cocaine, which is actually, I think, a shoe brand or something like that. But that's still there. I'm amazed this building hasn't been torn down, but somebody owns it and is still squeezing nickels out of backpackers. But Kowloon is a tremendous place just because it has so much street life and energy that, especially in the cool of the evening, it's just full of people out on the town. And again, you can go into the back alleyways. And Hong Kong's very safe. There's no crime to speak of in these areas, so you can wander around and you're perfectly safe at any hour of the night, and unless you meet Susie Wong. Now, it is still traditional markets. You have family-owned businesses and selling products from the mainland and other parts of Asia. Here, this is a medicine shop, so you can browse some of the Chinese culture right there in the middle of this tremendously big city. And you can go to the fanciest of restaurants, all kinds of cuisines, you name it, Hong Kong has it. But the Cantonese food, of course, is the feature of the city. And then there are these palatial restaurants everywhere. Further up in Kowloon is the old, called Kowloon Town originally. Now, when it was just a small offshore island, there were some native Cantonese who lived in a walled village. And even though the wall was taken down over 100 years ago, it remained in its original state when it was built up with higher blocks. And this used to be the home of the infamous triad gangs. And it was said in the olden days that the British would never be allowed to go in unless they had got permission from the triads. And I used to know a Royal Hong Kong police officer who spoke Cantonese even though he was from Scotland. And he said it was his great honor that he was allowed to go and meet with his colleagues in old Kowloon Town. Now, it's a lot of these older blocks are being torn down just because the conditions are not so good in them, and they're building newer ones all around. And you'll see that Hong Kong is quite different from when it was like this. When the British first sailed in and looking for a safe harbor, and this was a fairly lush offshore island, and the waters were good. There was fresh water coming off the mountains. And that's one reason why it got its name. Hong Kong, or Xianggang in Mandarin, means the fragrant harbor because of the fresh water sources there. Now it has many other fragrances, sort of like Halong Bay that way. But you can imagine what it was like in contrast. Here's looking at what is now Central Victoria Peak, back when it was a very in a small place. As I said, the major city was up in Canton, in Guangzhou. And here's an old Admiralty chart of the islands coming in here, then going up the Pearl River estuary. Now, traditionally, the Chinese had this area heavily fortified. They had, they had cannon, they had their navy to protect the Pearl River and Canton. That was the major trading city of traditional China. There were Arab merchants, Indonesian, Japanese, everybody would come in here. But Hong Kong was this island off the way that was only of great interest when the Royal Navy was looking for a base. And during the First and Second Opium War, the Royal Navy was based there. They went up and they bombarded Canton, blew out the Chinese Navy there, and then ceded by the Treaty of Nanjing in 1854 the island of Hong Kong. And so when it was given over as a British territory, because of its limited size, the new territories were leased on the 99-year lease that was written in 1897, so that in 1997, when that lease was to be renewed, there was a significant problem. Now, I'm going to run through a little bit of this. Hong Kong then became a place where many Chinese dissidents would go because they were under British protection. They could publish or speak and be safe from the agents of the imperial police. Most famously, Sun Yat-sen, the founder of the Republic of China, took refuge in Hong Kong. Then he ended up in Hawaii. Then he ended up in London, where the Chinese imperial agents tried to kidnap him. Again, he came back and ended up in Hong Kong, and then led the 1912 revolution that set up the Republic of China. Similarly, Hong Kong was sheltering communists from the nationalists at a time. And so you have this mix of people who came to Hong Kong, often for political purposes, and to this day that's still true. Now then the Japanese invaded, and then I list here Race for Hong Kong, 1945. More turmoil in the 60s as more refugees came out of China and during the Cultural Revolution. And then Hong Kong really came into its own from the mid-70s and with the opening of China to now become a very prosperous city. And then so when it is returned to China in 1997, it was this great fatted goose of prosperity, which was historically quite different from its roots. Now here's when the British first came, they set up administrative offices, services especially for the Navy and the merchant vessels, and started to build a community based upon the Cantonese that were there, but they brought in more people. And so you can see how it used to be full of the native vessels, and then there'd be tall ships, warships, and so it developed to what it is today. The harbor was much broader then because it has been landfilled out probably as far as the farthest vessel, and Victoria Harbor is about half the size it was naturally. And even now there's controversy in Hong Kong. Every time there's a new proposal to build out into the harbor, it constricts the tides, it makes it less of a port than it used to be. But here's a bit of a nostalgia for some of you. Here's the Hong Kong flag with the emblem. You see the dragon and the royal lion all together, and one of the old stamps with King George on it. This is somewhat of a collector's item. You can still buy them in the souvenir shops for those of you who want to have a taste of the old colonial time. But here again, the harbor and Kowloon, you can see how it was just hills and villages back then. Here is the old Kowloon town that I showed you a picture of earlier. But all of this is just a great wall of urbanity now. Most of these old colonial buildings are all gone. There's hardly any of them left because of the commercial pressure. But that was back in the days before elevators and air conditioning and things like that. One of the few remainders of the colonial era is the Legco building and the court system. There used to be a beautiful club next to it, the Hong Kong Club, similarly sort of late 19th century building, but that was torn down, replaced by a Furama Hotel recently. That's the Bank of China right behind, the HSBC Bank, and the old Bank of China building right there. There's a club up on the top of that you can go up to called the China Club. And this is a view of Wan Chai. And again, the land has moved out considerably, but you'll see that this is the old Navy base, and there's the old Fleet Club and the Royal Navy Club were along here. When aviation came in and flying boats would fly across the Pacific and from Europe, that made, again, Hong Kong a major transportation center. And Cathay Pacific was founded in Hong Kong to service these international flights and goes on to this day with one of the leading airlines in the world. Then, December 7th, 1945, the Japanese jumped, and they came and bombed Kai Tak Airport, and their troops came over the mountains, and as they did in Hawaii and Singapore, they did not declare war. They took action, and then it was left to the Foreign Office in London to send a protest note to Tokyo that you have bombed our cities. And then the Japanese never declared war. Everybody else had to do it, as if it was a big surprise. And so here's some Japanese illustrations of their coming down Kowloon, and they're going to fight the few troops that were defending Hong Kong, but it was such a surprise that there was no time to even adequately prepare the defenses. So the Japanese marched in as they did in Singapore, and took over the city. Now, they said they were liberating it from British rule, but of course, like everywhere else, they became far crueler and merciless to the Hong Kong people. Many people were executed, many things were looted, and the Japanese had their way with the town. This is on the other side of Hong Kong Island, Stanley Jail, which was a British Army installation originally, and it was a civil jail, but it turned into the detention camp for the British personnel, military personnel, but also for many Hong Kong residents were sent there. Anybody with any inkling of influence in Hong Kong business and government was sent to these incredibly big internment camps, and many people sat out the whole war sitting and sweating in these jails, and it's a very bitter memory for many Hong Kong people. Now, then the Japanese, though, thought that they had won the Pearl of the East, and they set up their headquarters at the Peninsula Hotel. And here's a period propaganda poster saying the health of the city depends upon your allegiance. And so the Hong Kong people were expected to be happy to be part of the Japanese Empire. Of course they weren't, and it didn't really work out that way. Now I pause here to show you not a picture from Hong Kong. This is from my brother George's research about our grandfather's work on the U.S.-Chinese Military Commission, and he went to Hanoi at this time to arrange the Japanese surrender for all of French Indochina, and this is he called them the Jap bastards. He never called them their actual name, and he was the liaison with General Ho Shai Lai, who was the designated by Chiang Kai-shek to arrange the Japanese surrender. The Japanese insisted there always be Allied officers there because they knew the Chinese were so angry with the war and all the atrocities that there'd just be a big bloodbath. So all through South China, up to Shanghai, all of the Japanese were allowed to keep their weapons so they could defend themselves as they were orderly retreated or put on ships and sent back to Japan, disarmed only once they were on a ship home. And so this was a surprise because the war ended suddenly. The Japanese were ruling much of Asia, and then these officers are reading the terms and then grumbling in their utter unconditional surrender. This was done in a very orderly way, and our grandfather was the one there who would write the statements for the Chinese so it wouldn't end up in a gunfight at the ceremony. That he described these Japanese officers as sour, and at one point he said they bowed like a jackknife with a bellyache because they couldn't stand to have to bow to the Chinese. And so it was an interesting time, I suppose. But he was sent to Hong Kong. But at the time, going from Hanoi, he arranged the surrender of the Japanese on Hainan Island right out here. And then he went back to Canton, where there was the large city, and the Chinese army had moved in, but they were still fighting some Japanese units, and the city was in flames in places. And one of his journals said he was supposed to go to Hong Kong to accept the Japanese surrender there. But as he noted, the Brits took care of that. The Royal Navy sailed up right into Hong Kong harbor, and a number of prisoners in Stanley were let out of the jail. They went over to the governor's house, and the governor's wife had sewed a Union Jack British flag into a pillow, and they were told where it is, so they went there, they cut open the pillow, they raised the flag, and then the Japanese, according to what they're supposed to do, surrendered to the Allies. And so Hong Kong became suddenly British again when it was President Roosevelt's policy that none of these colonies should be given back to Europe. They should become independent countries. And that was what Chiang Kai-shek expected, to have Hong Kong to be Chinese again. But since our grandfather was late and the British came in, it became a colony again. Of course, the French took back Indochina, and the Dutch took back Indonesia, and the wars went on to the final result for them. But Hong Kong maintained itself as a crown colony, and had it been given back to China in September